Good morning, everyone. Today we have Leah with us, and I'll ask Leah all the way from Uganda to give us an introduction of who she is. I've known Leah for a number of years now. Very, very inspiring, some amazing work in the feminist movement, and has such a really articulate way of expressing issues on macroeconomic policy from a very strong feminist rooting. So Leah, I'll just ask you to introduce yourself, who you are personally, and a little bit of like what you like to do as well, who you are professionally, and what political leanings are you leaning to?
Okay, thank you so much, Crystal. Thank you for the really nice introduction. I'm really thankful to Nawi for giving me this opportunity to come and share my views on this platform. I hope that there will be some learning and that maybe I'll share some new information. Most of it will not be new because obviously we build on the body of knowledge that other people have created before. So personally, like Krista said, my name is Leah Eryenyu. I'm based in Kampala, Uganda, and I am a Ugandan. I come from a family of 7 girls. There's a very long story there. And a lot of my identity and my politics calcified around the experiences that I had growing up as a woman in Uganda and growing up in a family of mostly women. Professionally, I'm the head of programs at Akina Mama wa Africa, which is a feminist Pan-African leadership development organization. And politically, I identify as a feminist. I think it's important to have that identity and share it publicly, because for me, it communicates that in every work that I do, I am trying to politicize that struggle and therefore to look at cutting them at the root and engaging with the structural issues, as opposed to some of the more cosmetic and reformist things that we usually find in social justice work. So thank you so much for having me, Crystal.
Great, thanks, Leah. So today we're gonna have a conversation around Akon, his recent trip to Uganda, but that, that as a manifestation of this bigger narrative discussion, conversation around privatization. And somehow with the pandemic, it's been seen as a health crisis, but I think more than that, and I know the feminist movement has been saying this, it's more than just a health crisis. It's an economic crisis. It's a political crisis. It's a governance crisis. It's a crisis of an inequality between North and South, and inequality even within global South, within countries that we live and are citizens of. So it's just like, layers of crisis, right? And problems that continue to manifest, but had deep rooting that already existed. Healthcare, for example, and I remember linked to privatization, you wrote a paper about 2 years ago about a hospital that was coming up in Kampala, I think it was. And tell us a little bit about, what privatization has looked like in Uganda, with specific leanings towards healthcare, and what it means now with the pandemic and how it's manifesting in this space and this time. Year 2 of this pandemic, which feels like we've been living through this for like years. And I don't know if I can see a light at the end of the tunnel, but let's talk about healthcare privatization in Uganda.
Okay, so those were very many questions and thoughts, Crystal. But let me try one at a time, and you can jump in and remind me of something that I've forgotten. But yes, let's start with Akon, and then we'll talk about healthcare. So just some background to everybody who's watching. Akon was in Uganda just last week. He had a meeting with the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, and he was presenting a business prospect of building a super city in Uganda, which would have its own currency and things like that. You might have heard of a similar project that was supposed to happen in his country of origin, which is Senegal. And to date, that project has not been realized. But the reason why I want to talk about Akon is just the manner in which he was welcomed. Of course, he's a celebrity, so he's bound to come with a lot of buzz. But despite the fact that he's a celebrity, his experience illustrates the experiences that many private investors have in Uganda, which is having a red carpet rolled out. You need land, here you go. You need labor that can be exploited. You don't have to pay minimum wage, here you go. You need an industrial park, here you go. So a lot of accommodations are made for foreign investors. And the idea is always that we are not in a position to negotiate and that we need the investors more than they need us. But of course they need us. That's why they're coming to have these conversations with us. But the Akon situation particularly just looks at how tone deaf the proposals they're making are in relation to the needs that average Ugandans have. So this super city is supposed to have, all these expensive condominiums and things like that. But that is not what Ugandans are looking for. The average Ugandan in the private sector makes an average income of about $65 a month. And that is a man. Women make $32 a month. I don't know what the cost for Akon's condos would be, but these days when I see private developers, they have condos of $100,000, and I keep asking myself, who's the target market for this? So the larger point that I'm trying to make is just this. There's just this idea of open for business for private investors, so they can come and invest and get all their money, and no mind is actually paid to the actual needs of the people. And what Ugandans really want is affordable public housing. What usually happens in these situations, and has happened before, is that an investor will come, people will actually get evicted, and they'll make them promises that, oh, when the construction is done, you get the first opportunity to buy. We've had projects where people have been evicted and the projects have never come to fruition. And just like in the housing sector, which is what is happening with Akon, this has happened with the education sector and with the health sector as well. There is this valorization of the private sector, and that valorization comes from the idea that the private sector is very efficient and that it does things better than government, which is actually not true. There's some things that they do marginally better. But it also doesn't mean that because they do things better, then the investment should go to them, because at the end of the day, the social contract that we have is between us and our government, and we're paying taxes through the nose. Actually, very recently, the Ministry of Finance tabled another bill to increase taxation for internet data, add a 12% tax to internet data. Ugandans are already struggling. We're already living, because of the pandemic, more and more of us are now working online. And now you're introducing a tax to make it even harder for people to access the internet. So, of course, space has been created for the private sector to thrive because of the history that we have with the structural adjustment programs, as happened in all African countries. You have the IMF and the World Bank stressing austerity measures, and the government practically being forced to close, having to close schools, having to close hospitals, having to close railways. It's always incredible when you think about, for much younger people like myself, finding dilapidated and unused railways, and they tell you, oh, this actually used to take you all the way to Kenya, and these days the only thing that happens are the cargo trains. So there are no passenger trains. It is so difficult for us to travel within the East African community. Actually, I was just watching a video yesterday where they said the trip from Kampala to Uganda, which is about 500 kilometers, and about 50 minutes by air, is some of the most expensive stretch of flying in the world. And this is all because of privatization, and most of these players are private players. So when we look at the health sector, of course, the structural adjustment programs came and decimated the health sector. The healthcare workers could no longer earn a living wage. Budget allocations to the health sector were no longer prioritized. And because people were no longer getting the great services that they needed from public hospitals, then of course, then they started seeking for private alternatives. But then the situation was that most people didn't necessarily challenge that new way of doing things. What then they started thinking was, I just need to work really hard, get rich, so that then I can be able to afford these new services. And we need to challenge that kind of thinking and push back and say, no, first of all, the majority of the population, will never be able to afford these private healthcare services. So it means that we need to invest in the public sector so that everybody, regardless of their station and positioning in life, will be able to get life-saving treatment, will be able to live a decent life. So now with the COVID-19 pandemic in Uganda, just like everywhere else in the world, all of this has been blown open. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was just this collective, almost kumbaya feeling across the world of, we're going to get through this, none of us understand what this is. And governments initially acted similarly. So first, they made COVID-19 tests available free of charge. I remember that so well. And then suddenly, in the Ugandan context, they did it for about a month. And then suddenly they said, well, we can't do this in perpetuity. Sorry, you're going to have to do the tests on your own. And at the time the government was actually doing the tests, the number of COVID-19 cases that were being reported were actually significant. But then the moment the government pulled out and people had to do the tests themselves, the numbers dropped. And a COVID-19 test in Uganda is between $50 to $90, depending on where you're going and how quickly you want the result. Remember, again, the nominal, the average earning is $65 for a man and $32 for a woman. Who's going to go for a COVID test? Nobody. Nobody is going to be able to afford it. So the majority of Ugandans couldn't. And then the same goodwill was also extended to treatment. So at the beginning, you could actually go to a government hospital and you could get treated free of charge. And then that also changed when they said, oh, our coffers are empty. So they said, our coffers are empty. All the while, passing supplementary budgets, getting loans from the IMF, getting loans from the African Development Bank. And so then we're saying, so where is this money going if you're borrowing on our behalf, but you're still not able to provide this service free of charge? But then the biggest deficiency then became obvious when then people got sicker and government hospitals were simply not able to cater to their needs. You need oxygen. Most government hospitals simply do not have that. So then the private sector came to swooped in and saved the day as well. But you literally had to pay through the nose, excuse the pun, because of the COVID test. You literally had to pay through the nose. And it's just not sustainable. So obviously, a COVID-19 positive test then for most people was a death sentence. And so these are some of the things that we're working with. Now we're seeing the same thing happen with the COVID-19 vaccine. There is just sense of complacency and, sorry, there is nothing that we can do about this. You have to figure this thing on your own that the government has, that is just incredibly enraging. So in the case of Uganda, they were able to secure about 800,000
doses.
Yes, 800,000 doses from the COVAX facility for AstraZeneca, which means you need 2 doses. So this is about for 400,000 people. And of course, other problems came up with that. This is now a bigger global problem where we don't have negotiating power. We're getting the doses at a significantly higher rate, which is about $7 compared to about $2-3 that EU countries were getting. But we're already hearing, we can't really fund this, and they've now given private players license to import COVID-19 vaccines, and we already know what that means. And to show you how uncommitted the government is to the process, in the middle of a pandemic, they are actually thinking about cutting allocations to the health budget in the 2021-22 financial year. So it just boggles the mind. So what we're definitely seeing is a private sector supplanting the mandate of the state, and the state is happy to let go of their duties and responsibilities because then the pressure is lessened on them. So as long as their families are safe, which is obviously going to happen, private sector players can come and do business as they wish. Yeah.
So let's also then speak a little bit about stimulus packages, because this has been, the thing that we're all talking about. And research that NAWI has been working on shows by the end of September 2020, a total of 45 countries had adopted 189 social protection and labor market measures in response to the pandemic. But only 16% of these measures were considered gender sensitive, and only 19% of the total of 98 fiscal and economic measures adopted aim to strengthen women's economic security. And so that's, it's bad enough for majority of Africans who exist and work in the informal space, right? Already, those economic stimulus packages don't really affect them. I mean, I remember Kenya had tax holidays or tax cuts for, if you earn a certain amount, but how many people are in the formal space to be able to have a pay as you earn, to be able to benefit from that, right? But then also zoom in on women, and there's absolutely almost nothing there for women who grow 60–70% of Africa's food, for example, exist, are taking care of children, old people, carrying our economies, our societies, our communities, our families, literally on their backs. So I'm just curious to hear from you in the case of Uganda, what has been the experience? This was, what I just spoke about was a broader bird's eye view of the continent, but I'm also really curious to hear what happens in a very specific country, Uganda, and your experience as a Ugandan woman.
Yeah. So my analysis of not just the stimulus package, but the government's response generally to the ravages of the pandemic was that it was very anti-poor and very gender blind. So they were all just this very blanket and not well thought through proposals that didn't necessarily think about people on the margins. So they thought about big businesses. There is always that idea of there's certain businesses that are too big to fail. And so then the government will use all its resources to try and prop up these governments, give them rescue packages with the idea that, they're actually going to employ people, but they never put any, there are never any conditions. There are never conditions like, because we've given you this money, then you should not lay off people for a certain period of time, which is what happened, I think, in countries like the UK. Here it was just like, you need the loan, and there was certain paperwork that was available. I want to speak about the response in terms of social protection. In Uganda, I would say that is non-existent. First of all, even before the pandemic, we didn't really have a robust social protection program. The only social protection is in the form of the National Social Security Fund, which is available at retirement. This is a pension scheme. It's available at retirement. And because we didn't have a robust, we don't have a proper safety net for people. When people lost their jobs, people lost their livelihood, they had nowhere to draw from. So then at that point, there were demands for the NSS, the law around the National Security Fund to be revised to allow people short-term access to their funds, because there were no welfare checks given the way we hear about them being talked about in the US. That is such a far off dream for us. But even just the small things, thinking about people living with disabilities in Uganda. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head right now. But right now, in order to qualify for some kind of government help, if you have a disability, you must first have a job. So if your disability is so severe that you cannot work, then sorry for you. That is literally what happens. So in order to qualify for any kind of, and this is what the government considers a social protection program, you must have a job, and then the government will give you a loan, and then you do a business, the usual shtick. Some of the responses to some of the challenges that came up, of course, there was food relief. I think that was done across the continent. in the case of Uganda, I think each family was given about 2 kilograms of maize flour and some beans. That's it. Like I remember, I think the lockdown was about six weeks or thereabouts, and every family was given just one round, and nobody ever came back to say, do you need things replenished, or things like that. And there's so many people that went hungry, that had one meal a day, that would make some porridge to feed their children. But then also what the government ignored was that people in rural areas also needed this support. So that was something that was not given at all. I actually remember, and I'm quoting the president, he told people in rural areas that this is not a poverty alleviation program. If you were poor before the pandemic, you continue to be poor. We shall deal with you later. That's literally what he said. Yeah. So when it came to the stimulus specifically, of course they looked at businesses as the engine for reviving the economy. So that is where the focus was. The challenge was in terms of businesses that were given the biggest allocation for the stimulus. They looked at massive, well-established businesses that are not, most of which are not even owned by Ugandans. Okay, so they do employ Ugandans, but most of them are not owned. So the majority of people could not even qualify for those low interest loans. And then the smallest portion of the stimulus was given to an initiative that was focusing on the informal sector. And that is where the majority of women are positioned. Women literally hold up the informal sector. So I remember that the allocation to that was about $70 million. Even in the context, like that is really tiny. If you know that the majority of your population is positioned there, and that this particular sector, even when it's continually invisibilized, actually makes a significant contribution to the GDP, then you give them, literally nothing. But then what made this quite challenging was that even when they made the funds available, accessing them was quite difficult. So there were just so many stringent measures. So this fund was focusing on people like salon owners. Do you ride a boda, the motorcycle taxis? Do you really have those really tiny businesses? But then in order to access the loan, you had to form a group. You had to open a bank account. You had to get an endorsement from one of the local government people. So the process was just too long. And to date, there's so many people that have not yet accessed the loan. This is 1 year later, 1 year since the world really was turned upside down. And the majority of people have still not been able to access loans that that are critical for them to live a decent life. And because this process is just so difficult and it's just so complex, women are then forced to turn to loan sharks. So there's predatory lending. They're giving them money, and these women are not even borrowing this money for their businesses, because even at this point there's really even no business to speak of. They're borrowing this money to put food on the table. And I feel that these are some of the things that those policies missed, because there needed to be a sense of urgency to say that this is a matter of life and death, because everybody was affected, but specifically for people that make a daily wage. If you go to town every day and you come back with $2, $3, you're not the kind of person who has the luxury to wait for 12 months to get a loan in order for you to have a good life for your family. So that is really what happened. But even for the bigger loans that were not given to the informal sector, most of them were given to, in terms of healthcare, only about 2% was allocated to healthcare services. And even I think there was a report that came out last month that showed that even for the healthcare service providers that applied for those loans, they had still not been disbursed. And these were the people who are in the line of fire, risking their lives, making sure that we are all getting better, and they're not prioritized. But a business such as the army, the police, the savings group, there's a huge army savings group, actually got a huge loan, they applied for their loan and got all of it in full. So it really shows that there is a lack of priority, and that people that actually exist on the margins are simply not prioritized.
And I guess this also speaks to a problem that continues to happen pre-COVID, through COVID, and I guess if you can't stop it forevermore, hopefully we can stop it. But most governments, on the continent are somewhat they're doing for women economically, and they're like, oh, we have a women's fund. And this women's fund will, the same problem, because I hear the same exact thing in Kenya. You have to form a group of about 10 women, and the rigmarole and the bureaucracy and red tape to actually apply for this funding, which is, comes in the form of either low interest or no interest loans. When you break it down per individual, comes to about, $100 or less, or a little bit more, not very much. And I remember speaking to a lady who said, well, it's not really going to help my business. And so her and her friends just use the money to buy dresses and handbags that they'd been looking at, but didn't have the money to buy, right? Because the money is interest free, so I can get that dress that I've always wanted to get. But in terms of business, it doesn't really make a dent. And so this idea of constantly focusing on very myopic livelihood projects, even by our own government, relegating women's lives to micro lives constantly and consistently, whereas systemic issues that continue to exist. Can I have access to actually not unaffordable, a free COVID test? Can I have access to universal healthcare? Can I have access to a rail that can take my produce from my village or my farm to the marketplace, or a road to do that? Those things, those systemic things that make life for women dignity, dignified lives, and, make being a citizen a thing that you can be proud of, constantly are amiss. Instead of that, we have all these little bits of solutions. Yeah. And even within those micro bits, there's you have to do 5 cartwheels and write up, I don't know how many concept notes. And so people just don't even apply for them. So that's been a really interesting, trend of a problem that existed and continues to exist even as a response to COVID, where it's like you're saying, it's an emergency, right? It's, this people's livelihoods are at stake, but even then they're still being made to fill in all this paperwork. Yeah. So with healthcare, what is that as we go into the era of vaccine equity and what that means? And I know you spoke about how Uganda now has 800 vaccines, which is about 400,000. I know the African Union CDC has negotiated for about 800 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines to be produced in South Africa. What's the sentiment in Uganda, and with the influx of private vaccines as well? Kenya had Sputnik coming in. It was banned last week. We don't know what this means. I hear things going on in the court system, but I'd really be interested to know what it's like in Uganda with regard to privatization of vaccines and also universal access to vaccines.
Yeah. I think there is just a lot of skepticism and fear, and you have to realize that and so much disinformation, and most of this already existed even before the vaccines were successfully tried out. There was lots of conspiracy theories about the origins of COVID to begin with, and those were never sufficiently challenged. So you find WhatsApp groups to be these very toxic and very toxic and very well equipped spaces for sharing terrible information, and aunts and moms and sisters are always such great consumers, and they get scared and they pass it on to the next person. And I feel that is exactly what has happened in the case of Uganda. There are 2 things that have happened. There is a lot of misinformation about what is in the vaccine and what the impact is. And also because of what has come out of Europe, that, some people are suffering some side effects but I think they tried to allay those fears, saying that out of 20 million doses administered, there were just about 79 cases of people that then developed blood clots, which is a super, super, super tiny number. But a lot of people are thinking, what if I'm one of the 79? I don't want to be one of the 79. So I feel that there has not been a sufficient campaign just to educate people and allay their fears. The second thing is the government has actually just not done a good job of making the vaccines available to the demographic that they considered as important, as critical to the first phase of administering the vaccines. So they had said that give them to teachers, health workers, and then people above the age of 50. What we've seen, so Uganda got the 800,000 doses about a month ago, but believe it or not, only about 129,000 vaccines have been administered. That is such a terrible track record. So that already shows you that perhaps the problems are beyond logistics. But I have seen on social media, people expressing dissatisfaction that, their parent who's, a bit far away from the city, who's eligible and actually would like to have the vaccine, has been unable to access the vaccine. So I think the government has failed to educate and allay fears and just let people know. And I know, they've done the publicity stance of having the president do it publicly, but that I felt did not move the needle, because there were already all these conspiracy theories about the president being immune. People will find a way to flip a narrative. They'll say the needle didn't go in. As they said with the Minister of Health, they're like, we didn't see it go in, and there was this doctored video, and people believe that. So that's the situation that we have, and that therefore makes me so anxious. If we are not getting people vaccinated fast enough, and we have the vaccine mutating, the virus is not sleeping. The virus is mutating and having a good time. And now we have the case of Brazil that we discussed earlier, where you have this P1 variant. You had 67,000 people dying in March. You have people that are younger getting sicker. You have people having a lower survival rate when they go on ventilators. That is something that should scare us. So it means that even for all the countries that are practicing vaccine nationalism, I mean, the US is hoarding, Canada is hoarding, that Brazilian variant is coming for all of us. There is no way of stopping it. So it's in our interest that everybody gets vaccinated as quickly as possible. Yeah.
Thanks, Leah. So I've been thinking a lot about joy, hope, happiness, glimmers even of those in a space and a time where everything seems so hard. Kenya's just signed a new program with the IMF. What that means, it feels like the 80s and 90s all over again. They've called for civil service to be shrunk, tax revenue to be increased. Like, it just feels exactly the same. It's just that I'm an adult now, and I've read and I can see it happen to my country in exactly the same way. We haven't learned from history. Lay on top of that, Brazil and the P1 mutated virus. Tigray is going up in flames. Mozambique, the north of Mozambique, is also in strife. There's so much calamity, disaster that's happening. Is there anything that you're hopeful for? Is there any glimmer of hope, of sparks of joy? It could be a song, it could be a story, it could be an experience, it could be something in the news, but something that you think, all of this, but at least this is going on.
Yeah. Obviously, that's a very difficult question to answer, because there are just so many things that have gone south. But I'll actually start with that example that you gave about the IMF loan to Kenya. I feel that there is a glimmer of hope there because of the way Kenyans have reacted. I have never seen anything like that. And I think it speaks to the importance of raising political consciousness. So I saw Wangari Kinoti this morning said, oh, it's really nice that this is happening, but we need to expand the conversation to go beyond just talking about corruption. But I think this is a great start. First, people to realize that the IMF is not always your friend. You know, they're always that person who's eager to give you money for you to buy things and have a good life, but their interests need to be questioned. So I think this is such a fantastic coming together and collective action, and people saying, take back your money, we don't want it, you're going to just saddle us in more debt, and then you're going to come for, we don't know what you're going to come for, we don't know what you're going to ask for in return, because the money is also a lot. It's a lot. So I felt that was, and they've just been spamming the IMF on all their platforms, Facebook, when they have a webinar. So I think the IMF they've understood. Okay, I don't know if they've understood, but they've got the message. And then the other thing that I could say is could be a source of hope is that, you know, I've been seeing news stories about possible breakthroughs in HIV treatment because of all the innovation and research and development that has happened with the COVID-19 vaccine. So I don't have all the details. I'm not an expert, but I think that this offers a glimmer of hope for a disease that has ravaged particularly the African continent. You know, a lot of us have lost relatives to HIV/AIDS for something that has ravaged for 30, 40 years almost. This is you know, if there is anything that looks like it could save us, you know, that is something that definitely gives me hope. And perhaps this is also the opening for all the research and development that's been happening around all the other difficult diseases, you know, like cancer. So maybe that's the silver lining with this pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, a silver lining indeed. I just really hope that the WTO and the TRIPS agreements can allow us to have access to all the research and development that's going on with, you know, research around an HIV vaccine and you know, cancer. I've lost 2 aunts to cancer. I know so many people who are survivors, but you know, it's such a huge struggle for so many Africans as well. But thank you for the glimmer of hope. Definitely, this last week, the last few days with Kenyans bombarding the IMF on everything. I'm sure the IMF comms team is very confused. Some people have constantly said that digital Kenyans have become the official opposition of this country. And it makes me proud to be Kenyan. But yes, that's definitely a glimmer of hope. And also considering that it wasn't organized in that way, it didn't come from a log frame or a project. It was a groundswell of anger to say stop. And so I hope we can continue with that. I hope there's a learning point there, like Wangari says. It doesn't just stop at corruption, but it's a bigger conversation. But it's definitely opened the door for that conversation. And so I'm really curious to see how this pans out and pans out with other, you know, global economic governance problematic points as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time, for your knowledge, for your wisdom, for your experience. You wove an experience of a very personal experience as a Ugandan citizen, as a Ugandan woman, in with a very, you know, policy-oriented narrative as well. So thank you so much for that. I wish you well. Good luck with the rest of the week. Stay safe, and I hope your family as well stay safe.
All right. Thank you, Crystal, and thank you for sharing with me this really nice. You know, it was like a conversation over a coffee. And thank you to Nawi again for the fantastic work that you're doing, platforming the voices and experiences of African women around macroeconomic issues that we probably would not have found so easily. So thank you.